August 23, 1942, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The eastern bank of the Volga River. Factory worker Alexei Petrov looks up from his lathe at the Red October steel factory, and what he sees makes his blood run cold. The sky is turning black with German bombers, hundreds of them, approaching the city in a formation so vast it seems to blot out the sun itself. The air raid sirens are wailing across Stalingrad, but there's nowhere to run, no shelters deep enough to protect against what's coming. Petrov and thousands of other workers and civilians can only watch in horror as 600 Luftwaffe aircraft begin their attack, dropping high explosive bombs and incendiaries that will transform Stalingrad into an inferno within hours. Wooden buildings explode into flame. Oil storage tanks erupt in massive fireballs. Columns of black smoke rise thousands of feet into the air and merge into a dark cloud visible for over 100 miles. The city burns for days after that initial raid, with fires spreading from block to block, creating firestorms that generate their own weather patterns. Winds strong enough to uproot trees and hurl debris through the air like missiles. Temperatures at ground level that melt metal and glass in the streets. Thousands of civilians die in the bombing and the fires that follow, trapped in buildings that become ovens, killed by collapsing structures, or by the smoke and flames that consume entire neighborhoods in minutes. But this aerial assault is merely preparation, just the beginning of what will become the most brutal battle in human history. For 6 months, 2 armies will fight over every building, every street, every room, every pile of rubble. Soldiers will measure their life expectancy in hours rather than days. An entire German army of 300,000 men will be destroyed, and the outcome of World War II will be decided in the ruins of a city that both Hitler and Stalin have declared must be held at any cost. Regardless of how many lives are consumed in the struggle. To understand why Stalingrad became the decisive battle of the Eastern Front, and perhaps the entire war, we need to understand the strategic situation in the summer of 1942. Germany is launching its second major offensive into the Soviet Union, after the failure to capture Moscow during the previous winter had demonstrated that the war wouldn't end quickly or easily. Hitler and his generals had confidently predicted a swift victory when Operation Barbarossa began in June 1941, but now they know better. Now they understand that the Soviet Union will not collapse from a single blow. Hitler has learned some lessons from 1941's failures, when German forces advanced on multiple axes toward Moscow, Leningrad, and Ukraine simultaneously. That strategy dispersed their strength, allowed the Soviets to concentrate reserves against the most dangerous threats, and eventually enabled them to halt the German advance just short of Moscow in December 1941. Then came the Soviet counteroffensives. That pushed German forces back from the capital and inflicted Germany's first major defeat of the war, shattering the myth of Wehrmacht invincibility that had sustained German morale since the war began. For 1942, Hitler decides to focus German offensive power in the south, with a clear strategic objective this time. The goal is capturing the oil fields of the Caucasus region, which would provide Germany with the petroleum resources it desperately needs to continue the war. At the same time, this would deny those resources to the Soviet Union, whose own oil production in the Caucasus is essential to maintaining Soviet military operations across the vast eastern front that stretches from the Arctic Ocean to the Black Sea. Operation Blue, as the 1942 summer offensive is designated, aims to advance through southern Russia toward the Caucasus oil fields around Baku and Grozny. These fields produce the majority of Soviet petroleum, the lifeblood of mechanized warfare, the fuel that keeps tanks moving and aircraft flying. But the plan includes what seems like a reasonable security measure, a necessary precaution to protect the left flank of this advance. German forces must capture the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River, which will block Soviet reinforcements and supplies moving up the Volga, and will prevent Soviet counterattacks against the flank of German forces advancing southward into the Caucasus Mountains. Stalingrad isn't initially the primary objective of the offensive. It's supposed to be a secondary goal, a flank security measure. The city is meant to secure the flank and control the Volga River transportation route that connects central Russia with the Caucasus region. But Hitler's obsession with symbolic victories, his belief that capturing a city bearing Stalin's name would damage Soviet morale and prestige, this gradually transforms Stalingrad from a secondary objective into the main focus of the entire summer campaign. This shift reflects Hitler's tendency to allow psychological and political considerations to override military logic, a pattern that recurs throughout the war. Prestige and symbolism matter more to Hitler than military effectiveness or strategic coherence, more than the survival of the armies he commands. He wants Stalingrad because it bears Stalin's name, because capturing it would be a propaganda victory, because he believes that symbolic victories translate into real strategic advantages. He's wrong, but no one can tell him that. No one dares contradict the Führer when his mind is made up. Stalin reciprocates Hitler's obsession for his own reasons, viewing the defense of the city bearing his name as a matter of personal and national prestige. This transcends purely military considerations, becomes a test of wills between the two dictators, whose ideologies and personalities shape the Eastern Front's brutal character. The Soviet dictator issues Order No. 227 in July 1942, the famous not one step back decree that will make Stalingrad even more horrific than it needs to be. The order forbids retreats without explicit permission, establishes penal battalions for soldiers accused of cowardice, and creates blocking detachments positioned behind frontline units. These blocking detachments have one mission: shoot anyone attempting to retreat without authorization. Kill your own soldiers if they try to run from German attacks. This order reflects Stalin's determination that Stalingrad will be held regardless of cost in lives or suffering, creating a situation where Soviet soldiers face death, whether they advance into German, fire, or retreat away from it. Both dictators, egos and ideologies have now become invested in a battle that will consume hundreds of thousands of lives, in pursuit of objectives that are as much psychological and symbolic as they are strategic. The stage is set for catastrophe, for a battle where military logic takes second place to political necessity, where soldiers will die not for strategic objectives, but for their leaders' pride. The German Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus receives the mission of capturing Stalingrad, and Paulus is in many ways the perfect representation of the German officer corps. His aristocratic background, his methodical staff officer mentality, his absolute obedience to orders even when those orders make no military sense. All of this makes him exactly the kind of commander Hitler wants. Someone who will follow orders without question. Someone who won't disobey, even when disobedience might save his army. Paulus has never commanded troops in combat before being given the Sixth Army, having spent his career in staff positions where he excelled at planning and organization and logistics. These are valuable skills, certainly, but combat command requires different qualities: decisiveness under pressure, flexibility when situations change, willingness to disobey orders when circumstances demand it. These are qualities that Paulus lacks despite his considerable intelligence and professional competence in other areas of military leadership. A Sixth Army that advances toward Stalingrad in August 1942 is a powerful force. No question about that. Approximately 300,000 men organized into 20 divisions, supported by hundreds of tanks, thousands of artillery pieces, an extensive Luftwaffe air support. including the bombers that will devastate the city on August 23rd. This is a veteran army, battle-hardened, experienced. These soldiers have participated in the victories of 1941, survived the brutal winter that followed, and they believe they're part of the most powerful military force in the world. They're advancing toward what they think will be another inevitable victory, another Soviet city captured, another step toward ending the war in the East. German soldiers have seen Soviet forces repeatedly defeated and pushed back over hundreds of miles during the previous year of fighting. They've seen Soviet armies encircled and destroyed. They've witnessed what appears to be Soviet military incompetence and weakness. So they're confident, perhaps overconfident, as they approach Stalingrad, expecting another relatively quick victory after some hard fighting. But the Red Army, that prepares to defend Stalingrad in late summer 1942, is significantly different from the Red Army that nearly collapsed during the initial German invasion in 1941. Back then, surprise, poor preparation, and Stalin's purges of the officer corps had combined to create catastrophic defeats. Those purges had killed or imprisoned thousands of experienced commanders, leaving the Red Army led by survivors who were loyal to Stalin, but often incompetent, terrified of making decisions that might be interpreted as defeatism or lack of revolutionary zeal. The disasters of 1941 cost millions of casualties, allowed German forces to advance hundreds of miles into Soviet territory within weeks, and seemed to demonstrate that the Soviet Union would collapse quickly under German attack. But the Soviet Union didn't collapse. It absorbed the blows and kept fighting. And now Soviet forces have learned tactical and operational lessons from their defeats. They've learned through the hard experience of combat that killed the incompetent and promoted those who demonstrated ability to survive and win battles. Soviet training has improved. Equipment has gotten better, including new T-34 tanks that are superior to most German armor in firepower and mobility, if not in crew training. American and British material aid is beginning to arrive in significant quantities through convoys to Murmansk and through Iran. Trucks and food and raw materials that help Soviet industry focus on producing tanks and weapons. Most importantly, Soviet soldiers had developed a grim determination born from fighting for survival against an enemy that has demonstrated through occupation policies what defeat means. German occupation means starvation, enslavement, murder. Soviet soldiers know this. They've seen it. They've heard the stories from refugees and from areas that have been liberated. They know they're fighting for their lives, their families, their nation, their system. This knowledge creates a fanaticism and willingness to accept casualties that shocks German troops who have become accustomed to Soviet forces retreating when faced with German tactical superiority and firepower advantages. The combination of ovation, improved Soviet tactical competence, better equipment, and desperate determination means that the battle for Stalingrad will be fundamentally different from earlier German offensives. This won't be another 1941-style encirclement where Soviet armies march into obvious traps and get destroyed through German mobile warfare. This will be something new, something the Germans haven't faced before, something that will test the Wehrmacht in ways it hasn't been tested. General Vasily Chukov takes command of the 62nd Army, defending Stalingrad on September 12th, just as German forces are beginning their assault on the city center. His appointment proves to be one of Stalin's better command decisions, one of the few times Stalin's instinct for choosing commanders actually works out well. Chukov is a tough man, practical, aggressive, someone who understands that defending a city against a superior enemy requires tactics very different from defending open terrain. Soviet forces have been repeatedly defeated in open terrain by German mobile warfare, by superior combined arms coordination that allows German forces to concentrate overwhelming firepower at breakthrough points and then exploit gaps with armor and mechanized infantry. But cities are different. Urban combat follows different rules, and Chukov immediately recognizes this. He understands that traditional military doctrine about maintaining coherent defensive lines and establishing clear command structures is irrelevant in urban combat. In city fighting, the front line can be the opposite sides of the same building, can be different floors of the same structure. Individual squad leaders will make life or death tactical decisions because communication with higher headquarters is impossible through the chaos of bombardment and close combat that rages continuously across the ruined cityscape. Chukov develops what he calls hugging tactics, a simple but brilliant concept that will frustrate German forces throughout the battle. The idea is this: Soviet defenders maintain positions as close as possible to German lines, sometimes just meters away. They're separated only by a wall or a pile of rubble or even just by different floors of the same building. This close proximity negates German advantages in artillery and air support because the Germans can't bombard Soviet positions without hitting their own troops who are fighting just meters away from Soviet defenders. German artillery observers can see Soviet positions, can call in fire missions, but the shells would kill German soldiers along with Soviet defenders. This forces the Germans into close-quarters infantry combat, the kind of fighting where there. Superior training and equipment matters less than Soviet desperation and willingness to fight in conditions that seem insane. German soldiers are trained for conventional warfare, for battles fought across open ground with clear lines of fire, for situations where combined arms, coordination can bring overwhelming firepower to bear on enemy positions before infantry has to assault and clear them. But in Stalingrad, none of that applies. None of those advantages help when you're fighting room to room with grenades and bayonets. Buildings become fortresses in Chukov's defensive system. Each structure is turned into a strongpoint that will be defended to the last man and the last bullet. German forces have to fight for every room and every floor in brutal close combat that consumes time and men while achieving minimal territorial gains. You might capture a building after days of fighting and dozens of casualties, but the building next door is just as strongly defended, and you have to start all over again. And even worse, sometimes you capture a building only to discover that Soviet troops still hold the basement, or that they've infiltrated back into parts of the building at night, and the fighting starts again. Sewers become supply routes that allow Soviet forces to move reinforcements and supplies under cover, avoiding German artillery and air attacks that make surface movement during daylight virtually suicidal. German observers watch the ruins constantly, calling down fire on anything that moves. Soviet soldiers learn to move only at night, to use sewers and underground passages, to infiltrate through gaps in German lines, like ghosts. Every pile of rubble becomes a defensive position that has to be taken and held through brutal hand-to-hand fighting. Both sides are exhausted, traumatized by constant violence, by the impossibility of rest or safety in a battle that rages 24 hours a day without pause or respite. There's no moment when soldiers can let down their guard or relax their vigilance against enemy attacks that can come at any moment from any direction. You might be fighting Germans in the building in front of you, while other Germans are fighting your comrades in the building behind you. And there's no front line, no rear area, just constant combat in 3 dimensions. The battle for Stalingrad proper begins in earnest in September, when German forces push into the city from the west and north. They advance through the suburbs first, fighting through residential areas where families lived until weeks ago, where children played in streets that are now killing grounds. Then they reach the factory districts, where massive industrial complexes, like the tractor factory, the Barricade gun factory, and the Red October steel factory, become separate battlefields. These factories are enormous, sprawling complexes with multiple buildings, workshops, warehouses, all connected by rail lines and roads. Fighting rages in these factories for weeks, as both sides feed reinforcements into the meat grinder and accept casualty rates that would have seemed unthinkable in any previous conflict. The fighting in the factories is surreal and nightmarish. Combat occurs across multiple levels of industrial buildings where production has continued even as battles rage around the machinery. Workers sometimes grab rifles and join the fighting when Soviet defensive positions are overrun. The line between soldier and civilian becomes meaningless in the chaos of urban combat. The massive machinery and structural steel of industrial buildings creates a three-dimensional battlefield that conventional tactics can't effectively address. Soldiers have to fight vertically through floors and horizontally through rooms. Combat that resembles no training scenario or doctrinal situation that peacetime military education has prepared anyone to handle. German forces make steady progress through September and October. That much is undeniable. They're gradually pushing Soviet defenders back toward the Volga River, compressing them into an ever-shrinking perimeter. At some points, the Soviet-held area is less than a few hundred meters deep from the riverbank to the front lines, which means German artillery can shell the riverbank directly. This makes Soviet supply efforts extremely dangerous as boats attempting to cross the Volga come under direct fire from German guns that have the landing areas registered .German. Commanders believe they're on the verge of final victory. They can taste it now. One more push, they think. Just one more major assault will throw the last Soviet defenders into the Volga and complete the conquest of the city. They've been saying this for weeks now. Each assault is supposed to be the final one, the breakthrough that will end the battle. But each final assault somehow fails to achieve the decisive breakthrough. Somehow the Soviets keep fighting from positions that seem militarily untenable. Soviet reinforcements continue arriving across the Volga despite German artillery fire air attacks that sink many boats and kill thousands during the crossing. Soviet defenders continue fighting from positions where defeat should mean certain death, where there's literally nowhere to retreat because the Volga River is at their backs. The river means that defeat equals death, either by drowning if you try to swim across, weighted down by equipment, or by German bullets if you stay and fight, or by execution from your own blocking detachments if you try to retreat without orders. The Volga River crossing becomes the lifeline that keeps Soviet forces in Stalingrad supplied and reinforced. The umbilical cord connecting the defenders to Soviet rear areas on the eastern bank. Soviet ferries and boats make this crossing mostly at night under cover of darkness. A desperate and dangerous mission that boat crews repeat night after night, knowing that each crossing might be their last. They're carrying fresh troops, ammunition, food, and supplies from the eastern bank, where Soviet rear areas are safe from German ground attack. They unload at the western bank under fire from German artillery. Guns that have the landing areas registered, and that open fire whenever movement is detected. German observers watch the riverbank constantly, looking for signs of boats approaching, calling down fire missions the moment they spot activity. The boats then return across the river, carrying wounded soldiers who need evacuation to hospitals that can't be maintained in the besieged city. Medical facilities have been destroyed by bombing. The constant combat makes treating wounded nearly impossible. Aid stations are subject to German fire. These river crossings are extraordinarily dangerous. Many boats are sunk by German fire, and their passengers are drowned or killed before reaching either shore. Soldiers weighted down by equipment can't swim if their boat is hit and sinks. They go straight to the bottom of the Volga and drown in darkness. Wounded soldiers being evacuated can't save themselves if the boat carrying them back to safety goes down before reaching the eastern bank. But enough boats make it across often enough to keep Soviet forces fighting, even when they're down to their last bullets. Even when they're eating horses and rats to survive the starvation conditions that develop as supply deliveries become increasingly irregular and insufficient. Volga crossing crews become heroes in Soviet propaganda, and many deserve that recognition for their courage. They're making repeated trips across a river that's essentially a shooting gallery, where German guns can fire at will on boats that have limited ability to defend themselves or take evasive action, while heavily loaded with troops and supplies. These men know the odds, know that most boat crews don't survive more than a few crossings before being killed or wounded. But they keep going back because the defenders need supplies and the wounded need evacuation. One of the most famous episodes of the Stalingrad battle, one that will be told and retold for generations, is the defense of Pavlov's house. This is a 4-story apartment building near the city center. Just an ordinary residential building before the war. The kind of place where families lived ordinary lives. Soviet Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and his platoon occupy this building in late September, and they will hold it for 58 days against repeated German assaults. The Germans throw everything at this one building, everything they have. Infantry assaults, tank attacks, sustained artillery bombardment that reduces much of the structure to rubble, but somehow never completely destroys it or kills all its defenders. Why does this one building matter so much? Because of its position, it overlooks a key square called 9th of January Square, and it has excellent fields of fire that allow Soviet defenders to control the surrounding area. From Pavlov's house, Soviet soldiers can interdict German movements, can fire on German troops trying to advance to the square, can make it impossible for German forces to move in this sector without taking heavy casualties. The building anchors Soviet defenses in this part of the city, prevents breakthroughs that might allow German forces to reach the Volga and split Soviet defenses in half. If Pavlov's house falls, German forces can advance, can push through to the river, can cut off Soviet forces to the north and south. So the building must be held, must be defended, regardless of cost. Pavlov's men, never more than about 30 soldiers at any given time, turn the structure into a miniature fortress. They fortify windows with sandbags and rubble torn from destroyed buildings, create firing positions that protect shooters while allowing them to engage German troops with rifles and machine guns. They mine the approaches so that German assault teams are blown apart before reaching the building's entrance. They establish interlocking fields of fire and mutually supporting positions. This defensive system allows 20 or 30 Soviet soldiers to hold off attacks by forces many times their size. German assault troops are supposed to be experts in urban combat. Elite soldiers trained specifically for this kind of fighting. But they can't dislodge these defenders, despite suffering terrible casualties in the attempts. The Germans attack again and again, sometimes multiple times per day. Infantry supported by tanks that drive directly up to the building and fire into it at point-blank range, trying to collapse walls and floors. German engineers use explosives trying to blow holes in the walls. Storm troops equipped with flamethrowers try to burn out the defenders. Artillery pounds the building until much of it is rubble. But the building holds. The defenders survive. Somehow they keep fighting. When ammunition runs low, resupply comes through the sewers. Soviet reinforcements infiltrate through German lines at night, carrying ammunition and food. When casualties mount, replacements arrive through the same underground routes. Fresh soldiers to replace the dead and wounded. The building holds throughout the 2-month period, takes damage that would render any normal structure uninhabitable. But Pavlov and his men stay, fight, survive. German commanders become obsessed with this one building. It becomes a symbol of their frustration, a visible reminder that they can't achieve final victory despite their superiority in numbers and firepower. They keep attacking it, keep losing men trying to capture it, keep failing despite everything they throw at it. Pavlov survives the battle. becomes one of the most decorated Soviet soldiers of the war, receives the Hero of the Soviet Union Medal for his defense of this single building. But he apparently dislikes discussing his wartime experiences in later life. Perhaps because the memories are too traumatic. Perhaps because he feels uncomfortable with the heroic image that propaganda creates around him. Perhaps also because he knows that his survival, while so many of his comrades died, is as much a matter of luck as skill or courage. And survivor's guilt is a heavy burden to carry. The fighting throughout Stalingrad follows similar patterns. Small groups of Soviet soldiers holding fortified positions that anchor the defensive line. These strong points prevent German breakthroughs, even when surrounded and cut off from supplies and reinforcements. They force German forces to reduce each position through prolonged siege and assault. This consumes time and men that Germany can't afford to waste. The battle is becoming an attritional struggle, where victory will go to whichever side can sustain casualties longer. These strong points absorb enormous German combat power. Assault troops spend days or weeks reducing single buildings while Soviet reinforcements infiltrate through sewers, across rubble fields, through gaps in German lines. The reinforcements keep the strong points supplied and garrisoned with fresh troops to replace casualties that mount steadily as fighting continues day after day without pause. The Germans discover that capturing a building doesn't mean they control it, doesn't mean the fighting is over. Soviet troops might still hold the basement while Germans occupy the ground floor, or Germans might control one wing while Soviets hold another wing of the same building. The fighting continues floor by floor and room by room, with grenades being the primary weapon, because rifles are often too long and unwieldy in the confines of bombed-out rooms. Visibility is measured in feet rather than yards. Combat is often too close for firearms to be effective. Soldiers fight with whatever they have. Bayonets when they have them. Entrenching tools when bayonets break or are lost. Sharpened pieces of metal fashioned into makeshift knives. Even bare hands in desperate struggles, where survival requires killing the enemy before he kills you. This combat is as primitive and savage as any warfare in human history, despite occurring in an industrial city, using modern weapons. The veneer of civilization strips away. Warfare reduces to its most basic form. Kill or be killed in close combat that allows no mercy and accepts no surrender. This kind of combat is psychologically devastating. There's no front line to hold and no rear area where soldiers can feel safe. Just constant fighting in 3 dimensions, where enemy soldiers can appear suddenly from basements or upper floors, through walls breached by artillery fire, through passages created by engineers with explosives. You might be eating a meal in what you think is a secure area, and suddenly, Soviet soldiers burst through a wall you didn't know was weak. And you're fighting for your life with a spoon or a fork or your bare hands. The casualties on both sides are horrific, the numbers almost incomprehensible. Soldiers last an average of 24 hours on the front lines before being killed or wounded. This is a statistical fact that both sides track. 24 hours, that's your life expectancy when you enter combat in Stalingrad. Some die in minutes, shot by snipers the moment they expose themselves. Some survive for days through skill or luck or both. But on average, 24 hours. That's all you get. This means units suffer complete turnover every few days. Experience soldiers become rare because few survive long enough to gain experience. The skills and instincts that help veterans survive can't develop when soldiers die before they can learn. German soldiers discover that their training in open warfare and mechanized operations is almost useless here. All the doctrine about combined arms coordination and maneuver warfare is irrelevant in combat that comes down to small unit infantry actions in bombed out. Buildings. The constant stress of urban combat produces psychological, casualties as numerous as physical ones. Men break down under the strain of continuous combat without rest or relief. Some freeze in combat, unable to move or function, staring blankly while bullets fly around them. Others crack completely, screaming, crying, running wildly until they're shot or restrained. Shell shock, combat fatigue. Whatever you call it, it's epidemic in Stalingrad. Affecting both sides equally, Soviet soldiers face all the same conditions, but with added burdens that make their situation even worse. They know that retreat can mean execution by their own blocking detachments, positioned behind frontline units with orders to shoot anyone who falls back without authorization. Getting permission to retreat is often impossible because communications in urban combat are so difficult. You can't reach your commanders to ask for permission when radio doesn't work and runners get killed trying to deliver messages. Soviet soldiers also know that capture by Germans means almost certain death, either through execution as commissars or communists, or through brutal treatment as prisoners of war. German camps for Soviet prisoners are death camps where prisoners die by millions from deliberate starvation, from disease, from exposure, from murder. Nazi ideology views Soviet citizens as subhuman Slavs, undeserving of the minimal humane treatment that international law theoretically requires for prisoners of war. This knowledge that there's no escape and no alternative to fighting means Soviet soldiers often fight with suicidal determination. Surrender offers no hope of survival. Retreat means being shot by your own side. The only option is fighting until killed or until the battle somehow ends in victory. This desperation creates combat effectiveness that surprises German troops who expected Soviet forces to break and run when faced with German firepower and tactical skill. German commanders, including Paulus, repeatedly report to Hitler that Stalingrad is taking too long to capture, that casualties are too high. The Sixth Army is being bled white, veteran units reduced to shadows of their former strength, divisions that should have 15,000 men now fielding 3,000 or 4,000. Paulus requests rest and reinforcement before attempting final assaults that will eliminate remaining Soviet defenders compressed into ever smaller areas along the Volga riverbank. Hitler invariably responds by demanding immediate victory regardless of cost, by promising reinforcements that never materialize in sufficient numbers. He insists that Stalingrad must fall quickly because his prestige requires it, because Germany's reputation demands it, because every day spent fighting for the city allows Soviet forces to prepare counterattacks. This insistence on victory, regardless of cost, is typical Hitler, symbolic and psychological considerations outweighing military logic. Prestige matters more to Hitler than preserving combat power for future operations, more than the lives of soldiers committed to missions that are becoming impossible. German forces in Stalingrad are trapped in a battle of attrition that negates their advantages in mobility and training, a battle that plays to Soviet strengths in defensive warfare and willingness to accept casualties. Western armies fighting under democratic governments can't sustain these casualty rates. Public opinion won't allow it. Families demand explanations when sons don't come home. But totalitarian states like Nazi Germany and Soviet Union can sustain casualties that would topple democratic governments. They control information, suppress dissent, execute defeatists. Still, there are limits even for totalitarian states, and by November 1942, the Sixth Army is approaching those limits. The army controls about 90% of Stalingrad, has compressed Soviet defenders into narrow strips along the Volga, sometimes less than 300 meters deep. Final victory seems imminent. One more major assault should complete the conquest. But this apparent success conceals strategic disaster in the making. Because the Sixth Army is exhausted from months of continuous combat, many divisions are severely under strength. Reduced to fractions of authorized manpower, after casualties that can't be adequately replaced. And most dangerously, the army is vulnerable to counterattack along extended flanks that stretch for hundreds of miles across the open steppe north and south of Stalingrad. These flanks aren't held by German troops, but by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian allied forces who lack the training, equipment, and motivation of German units. They'll collapse quickly if hit by serious Soviet attacks. Everyone knows this. But there aren't enough German troops to hold these sectors and fight in Stalingrad simultaneously. This is the weakness, the fatal vulnerability that Soviet commanders have recognized and will exploit. Soviet commanders, including Marshal Georgy Zhukov, coordinating operations from Stalin's headquarters in Moscow, have been planning a massive counteroffensive. They'll exploit the weak flanks to encircle German forces in Stalingrad, trap them in the same kind of pocket that Germans created for Soviet units in 1941. Those encirclement battles seem to demonstrate German invincibility in mobile warfare. Millions of Soviet soldiers surrounded and captured in operations like Kiev and Bryansk. Now the Soviets will do the same to Germans. Use the operational methods they've learned from defeats. Apply the lessons purchased with millions of casualties. Throughout October and early November, Soviet forces build up for this counteroffensive, while German attention focuses on fighting inside Stalingrad. Every German soldier, every German commander is obsessed with finally capturing the last Soviet positions. With completing the conquest of the city that's cost so much blood, Soviet forces assemble over 1 million troops supported by thousands of tanks and artillery, pieces and positions north and south of the city. They maintain strict security measures to prevent German intelligence from detecting the buildup, using camouflage and deception, moving only at night, maintaining radio silence. German intelligence fails completely, sees nothing, suspects nothing. The concentration of forces that will deliver the encircling attacks remains hidden until the moment of attack. Operation Uranus launches on November 19th from positions north and south of Stalingrad. Over 1 million Soviet troops attacking simultaneously. Thousands of tanks and artillery pieces smash through the Romanian 3rd Army north of the city and the Romanian 4th Army to the south. The attacks are coordinated, timed precisely, delivered with overwhelming force at breakthrough points where Soviet numerical superiority is crushing. The Romanian forces fight, as well as can be expected given their circumstances. Some units resist stubbornly and inflict casualties on attacking Soviet forces. But they're facing overwhelming odds, massive tank attacks that their limited anti-tank weapons can't stop or even slow significantly. Their defensive lines collapse within days. Soviet mobile forces pour through the gaps and begin racing westward toward the Don River. The objective is the town of Kalach, where the northern and southern Soviet pincers are scheduled to meet, where the encirclement will close, where 300,000 German soldiers will be trapped. The northern and southern Soviet pincers meet on November 23rd near Kalach. The encirclement is complete. The German 6th Army and portions of the 4th Panzer Army are trapped in a pocket roughly 30 miles. Across at its widest point, Stalingrad sits at the eastern edge of the pocket where German forces are still fighting. Soviet defenders along the Volga. Soviet forces surround the pocket on all sides. Immediately begin fortifying the encirclement ring with defensive positions, minefields, artillery concentrations. They'll prevent breakout attempts, keep the Germans trapped, destroy them systematically. This is the largest German force ever encircled. Approximately 300,000 men. Trapped, this represents a catastrophic defeat that threatens to change the entire strategic situation on the Eastern Front, losing 300,000 trained soldiers and their equipment will cripple German offensive capability, will free massive Soviet forces for operations elsewhere. Hitler faces a critical decision, the kind that will determine the fate of an entire army. Does he authorize the Sixth Army to break out toward German lines, which means abandoning Stalingrad and accepting symbolic defeat? Or does he order them to hold positions and await relief from outside? Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commanding the Luftwaffe and always eager to increase his influence with Hitler, makes a promise. His aircraft can supply the encircled Sixth Army by air, can deliver enough food, ammunition, fuel, and supplies to sustain 300,000 men through the winter. This promise is either a deliberate lie or a fantastical delusion, because the Luftwaffe would need to deliver approximately 500 tons of supplies daily. This is far beyond the capability of available transport aircraft operating in winter conditions against Soviet air defenses with limited airfields inside the pocket. The best the Luftwaffe ever achieves is around 100 tons per day on good days, with many days seeing far less or nothing at all. But Hitler believes Göring's promise, or wants to believe it, and he makes his decision. The Sixth Army will hold Stalingrad and await relief from outside. German forces will break through the Soviet encirclement and re-establish supply lines. This decision condemns the Sixth Army to slow death by starvation, cold, and attrition, because the Soviet encirclement is too strong to break from inside. The relief forces that will be assembled are too weak and too far away to break through before winter and attrition destroy the encircled army's combat capability. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, probably Germany's most capable commander, takes command of newly formed Army Group Dome with the mission of relieving the Sixth Army. Manstein has a proven record of success in mobile operations, in fighting against numerical odds. He organized the relief force built around the 4th Panzer Army that will drive northeast toward Stalingrad to open a corridor. Operation Winter Storm launches on December 12th. German panzer divisions advance rapidly through snow and cold despite Soviet resistance. For several days, it appears the relief might succeed. German tanks push to within 35 miles of the pocket's perimeter. Soldiers trapped in the pocket can hear the sounds of battle to their southwest, can see flares and explosions on the horizon. Rescue might be possible after all, despite the grim conditions inside, where rations have been cut repeatedly and men are beginning to starve. Manstein signals Paulus on December 19th. The panzer spearheads are approaching. The Sixth Army should prepare to break out. Operation Thunderclap, creating a corridor that will allow the encircled army to escape. But this signal puts Paulus in an impossible position, because Hitler has explicitly ordered him to hold Stalingrad, not to abandon the city under any circumstances, regardless of what happens with relief attempts. Breaking out would require abandoning all heavy equipment and most supplies, since the Sixth Army lacks fuel to move vehicles, lacks the transport capacity to carry ammunition and food. For 300,000 men during the fighting, withdrawal across 35 miles of snow-covered steppe while under constant Soviet attack. Paulus refuses to break out without explicit authorization from Hitler, and Hitler refuses to give that authorization. Abandoning Stalingrad is politically and psychologically unacceptable regardless of military necessity, regardless of the lives that will be lost. Hitler believes or claims to believe that Göring's Luftwaffe can supply the army indefinitely. That relief will eventually succeed, even if Winter Storm fails. This failure of command at the highest levels, where Hitler's refusal to accept reality and Paulus's excessive obedience combine to prevent the reasonable decision, means the window for escape closes. Soviet forces launch counterattacks against Manstein's relief force, stop the advance well short of the pocket's perimeter. They push back the 4th Panzer Army with new offensives that threaten to encircle the relief force itself, forcing Manstein to withdraw southward to avoid losing those forces along with the Sixth Army. By late December, any possibility of relieving or rescuing the Sixth Army has disappeared completely. The encircled forces face a choice: surrender immediately while they still have some strength and organization, or fight to the death while slowly starving and freezing in positions they no longer have strength to defend. Life inside the Stalingrad pocket during December and January becomes a descent into hell. That makes the earlier urban combat seem almost bearable by comparison. German soldiers face conditions that destroy units as effectively as combat itself, with food rations cut repeatedly as supply deliveries by air fail to meet even minimal requirements. 300,000 men need 500 tons of supplies daily just to survive. The Luftwaffe manages perhaps 100 tons on good days. Often less, sometimes nothing when weather grounds aircraft or Soviet action makes flying. Suicidal soldiers eventually receive just a few hundred calories per day when they need several thousand to maintain body heat and energy in brutal Russian winter. Temperatures drop to minus 30 degrees Celsius and colder. Men lack adequate winter clothing because much of the Sixth Army's cold weather gear was lost during the encirclement. Can't be replaced through air supply that prioritizes ammunition over clothing. Horses are slaughtered and eaten first, the most readily available source of meat. Then rations are cut further, as even horse meat becomes unavailable when all horses have been consumed. Soldiers begin dying from starvation and cold in numbers that soon exceed casualties from Soviet attacks. The human body can survive on minimal food for weeks, but not when exposed to extreme cold, and not when required to perform physical labor like manning defensive positions or conducting patrols. The combination of starvation and cold produces a death spiral where weakened men can't generate body heat, can't perform duties, become more vulnerable to cold, which accelerates starvation, which increases vulnerability to cold. Men lose weight rapidly. Healthy soldiers weighing 180 or 200 pounds drop to 120, then 100, then 90 pounds as their bodies consume muscle and tissue for energy. They begin to resemble concentration camp inmates, skeletal figures with sunken eyes and hollow cheeks, barely able to walk more than short distances without collapsing from exhaustion. And still they're expected to fight, to man defensive positions, to resist Soviet attacks that compress the pocket gradually and systematically. The wounded and sick accumulate in makeshift hospitals established in basements and cellars, lacking medical supplies that can't be delivered through air supply, lacking heating that would require fuel that isn't available. Thousands of men die from wounds that would be treatable under normal conditions. Simple infections become fatal without antibiotics. Broken bones don't heal properly without proper immobilization and nutrition. Frostbite leads to gangrene, which leads to death without surgical intervention that can't be provided. Doctors and medical personnel themselves become casualties of fighting or conditions, or succumb to the same starvation and disease, killing their patients. The medical system breaks down completely. Wounded soldiers are left in cellars with minimal care, dying slowly from wounds or cold or starvation. The psychological impact of these conditions on survivors is profound and lasting. Men who endure this will carry trauma for the rest of their lives. Assuming they survive long enough to have a rest of their lives, Soviet forces gradually compress the pocket through a series of offensives in January 1943, pushing German defenders back toward Stalingrad itself. The attacks split the pocket into smaller sections that can't support each other or coordinate defenses, allowing Soviet forces to defeat each section separately through concentrated attacks. German forces no longer have strength to resist effectively, even when they have the will to continue fighting, which many still do despite hopeless situation. The German soldiers still capable of fighting do so with courage born of desperation, knowing that surrender offers little hope of survival. Soviet treatment of German prisoners is harsh especially when those prisoners participated in the brutal occupation of Soviet territory. German forces committed numerous atrocities against civilians, implemented policies that killed millions of Soviet citizens through starvation, exposure, murder, harsh treatment. Soviet soldiers and civilians want revenge. Prisoners often pay the price for crimes committed by other Germans in other places at other times. But desperation and courage can't overcome accumulated effects of weeks of starvation and cold. Men lack physical strength to man defensive positions, to conduct counterattacks, even to walk more than short distances without collapsing. Grown men reduced to 90 or 100-pound skeletal figures can't fight effectively, no matter how brave or determined they are. The body has limits. You can't fight when you lack strength to hold a rifle or throw a grenade. Hitler promotes Paulus to field marshal on January 30, 1943, both in honor and in implied order. No German field marshal has ever surrendered in the entire history of Prussia and Germany. This is a tradition that supposedly defines German military honor. Hitler expects Paulus to either break out somehow against all odds or fight to the death, rather than accepting capitulation. The promotion is Hitler's way of telling Paulus what's expected. Die with your army rather than surrender and tarnish the German officer corps' reputation. But Paulus is a realist who understands that his army is destroyed beyond any hope of recovery. Continuing the battle will only waste lives of men who have already suffered beyond endurance for a lost cause that can't be justified by any military or strategic logic. On January 31, 1943, Paulus surrenders his headquarters and the southern portion of the pocket to Soviet forces. He becomes the first German field marshal captured alive. A shocking break with German military tradition. A humiliation for Hitler, who promoted him, specifically to encourage him to fight to the death. The capitulation brings effective resistance in Stalingrad to an end, though. Scattered groups in the northern pocket fight for another 2 days. They surrender when ammunition runs out, when their commanders recognize that further fighting accomplishes nothing except adding more names to casualty lists. These lists are already unbearably long, represent a catastrophe unmatched in German military history. A disaster that will be debated by historians for generations. The statistics of Stalingrad's butcher's bill are disputed because both sides manipulate figures for propaganda purposes, because accurate record-keeping was impossible during chaos. The general magnitude of the catastrophe is clear even if precise numbers remain uncertain. The German Sixth Army entered the battle with approximately 300,000 men, was effectively destroyed. Perhaps 90,000 soldiers were captured in the final surrender, too weak to resist or escape, having no choice but to lay down weapons and submit to Soviet captivity. Approximately 140,000 were killed during the fighting inside the city and during the encirclement, dying from combat, starvation, cold, disease. Perhaps 70,000 were evacuated by air before final collapse. Wounded flown out during early weeks when airlift still functioned at some level. Of the 90,000 captured at the end, only about 5,000 eventually returned to Germany after years in Soviet prisoner of war camps. The camps were located in Siberia and Central Asia, where prisoners were used as forced labor in mines and construction projects. They received inadequate food that left them constantly hungry and malnourished, unable to perform the hard physical labor demanded of them. Medical care was essentially non-existent. Minor illnesses became fatal. Wounds that would have healed with proper treatment killed through infection and gangrene. 95% died in captivity. A death rate that reflects both Soviet revenge and genuine inability to care for prisoners. When Soviet civilians themselves were suffering, Soviet casualties during the entire Stalingrad campaign were even higher in absolute numbers. Estimates suggest over 1 million casualties, including killed, wounded, and missing from summer 1942 through February 1943. This includes fighting inside the city, Operation Rhinus that encircled the Sixth Army, subsequent operations that defeated German relief attempts, and systematic elimination of the pocket. This horrific toll reflects Soviet tactical methods emphasizing mass and persistence over conservation of lives. Soviet leadership under Stalin placed less value on individual soldiers' lives than Western democracies did, viewed casualties as acceptable costs of achieving strategic objectives. From Soviet perspective, these casualties were acceptable because they achieved the strategic objective of destroying an entire German army, initiating the series of offensives that would drive German forces back to Berlin. Soviet population and industrial resources could replace losses. Germany increasingly could not, as manpower reserves dwindled and industrial production strained under Allied bombing and resource shortages. The strategic impact of Stalingrad extended far beyond immediate destruction of the Sixth Army. The battle demonstrated that the Wehrmacht could be decisively defeated through Soviet operational planning and execution, that German tactical and operational superiority was insufficient to overcome Soviet advantages in manpower and material when properly employed. Soviet commanders had learned from earlier defeats how to fight effectively against German forces, had developed operational art that matched or exceeded German capabilities. The battle demonstrated that Hitler's strategic decision-making was fundamentally flawed. His refusal to accept reality, his refusal to authorize necessary withdrawals, his insistence on holding positions for symbolic reasons rather than military logic. All of this led to catastrophes that could have been avoided through better leadership. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad became the turning point where defensive desperation transformed into offensive confidence. The Red Army proved it could not only survive German attacks but could plan and execute complex operations destroying German armies, rather than merely pushing them back. Soviet commanders demonstrated mastery of operational art, including deception that concealed preparations, concentration of force at breakthrough points, exploitation of enemy weaknesses, coordination of multiple fronts, conducting converging attacks. This required abilities that couldn't be dismissed as merely throwing masses at German defenses until they collapsed. German morale and prestige suffered catastrophic damage from the Stalingrad defeat. Germany had never before lost an entire field army in single operation. The disaster demonstrated to Germany's allies, enemies, and population that German victory was no longer inevitable or even likely. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility died in Stalingrad's ruins, replaced by grim recognition that Germany was fighting a war of attrition against enemies with greater resources who were developing military competence matching or exceeding German capabilities. The tactical lessons of Stalingrad influenced urban warfare doctrine for decades afterward. Military analysts from many countries studied how Soviet forces negated German advantages through close combat tactics, forcing Germans to fight on terms minimizing their strengths. Fortified positions absorbed enormous combat power while requiring relatively few defenders. Willingness to fight in conditions conventional doctrine said were untenable demonstrated that determination and terrain knowledge could overcome equipment advantages. The Hagging tactics Zhukov employed became standard doctrine for defending cities against enemies with superior firepower. Military forces worldwide recognized that maintaining close contact with attacking forces prevented them from using artillery and air support advantages, forced them into infantry combat where determination and terrain familiarity mattered more than equipment quality. The concept of turning every building into fortress became central to urban defense planning. Recognition that urban combat was fundamentally different from open warfare led to development of FARI, specialized training and equipment. Soldiers fighting in cities needed different skills than soldiers fighting in open terrain. Visibility was limited. Combat occurred in 3 dimensions across multiple building levels. Traditional concepts of front lines and rear areas became meaningless. Future conflicts from Berlin in 1945 to Hue in Vietnam, to Grozny in Chechnya, to Mosul in Iraq, demonstrated similar patterns. Defenders used urban terrain to negate attacker advantages in firepower and mobility. Battles became grinding attrition struggles, measured in buildings captured and casualties sustained, rather than in breakthroughs and exploitation. The human stories from Stalingrad are simultaneously inspiring and heartbreaking, revealing ordinary people enduring extraordinary suffering with courage that seems almost superhuman when examined from peacetime safety and comfort. Soviet soldiers defending Stalingrad became heroes in Soviet propaganda celebrating their sacrifice and determination. Many deserved recognition for genuine courage in holding seemingly untenable positions. But these same soldiers also committed acts of violence against German prisoners and German civilians later in the war, reflecting both revenge for German occupation policies and brutalization from prolonged combat, where death is commonplace and the enemies dehumanized through propaganda and experience. German soldiers fighting in Stalingrad demonstrated tactical skill and personal bravery, undeniable even by their enemies, enduring terrible hardships and continuing to fight effectively when strategic situation was hopeless. But these same soldiers served a regime that invaded a neighboring country without justification, that was simultaneously implementing genocide against Jews, Roma, communists, other groups deemed undesirable by Nazi ideology. This moral complexity means Stalingrad can't be reduced to simple narratives about good versus evil or heroes and villains. All participants were simultaneously victims and perpetrators caught in struggle where survival required abandoning peacetime morality, where institutional pressures from both sides encouraged or demanded behavior that would be criminal under normal circumstances. Soldiers on both sides shot prisoners when they couldn't be guarded. Both sides executed their own soldiers for cowardice. Both sides committed atrocities against civilians. Both sides fought with desperation, reflecting the ideological nature of the Eastern Front. This wasn't just a war for territory, but a war of annihilation between mutually hostile systems viewing each other as existential threats requiring total destruction. The physical remnants of Stalingrad's destruction persisted for years, as the city was gradually rebuilt from ruins, so thorough that in some districts literally no building remained standing. Reconstruction required clearing rubble and starting from bare ground to create new structures. The Soviet government designated Stalingrad as a hero city, one of highest honors recognizing exceptional courage and sacrifice during the Great Patriotic War. They built numerous monuments and memorials, commemorating the battle and honoring defenders who saved the city. The most famous is the Mamayev-Kurgan Memorial Complex, built on the strategic height overlooking the city. Crowned by the massive statue, "The Motherland Calls." The statue shows a female figure representing the Soviet motherland calling her sons to defend her, sword raised in dramatic pose that has become one of most recognizable symbols of Soviet victory and sacrifice. The statue stands 85 meters tall, one of the tallest statues in the world. The memorial complex includes eternal flames, reflecting pools, walls inscribed with names of defenders who died, creating space for remembrance and national pride in victory that came at terrible cost. The city itself was renamed Volgograd in 1961 during Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign, seeking to diminish Stalin's personality cult and acknowledge his crimes, including purges that killed millions, and forced collectivization causing famines. This name change was controversial. Many veterans felt it dishonored their sacrifice to remove Stalin's name from the city they defended at such cost. The debate over the city's name continues periodically in modern Russia. Some advocate return to name Stalingrad to honor the battle's historical significance. Others argue Stalin's crimes make honoring him inappropriate, regardless of battle's importance or sacrifices made. Historians continue debating various aspects of the Stalingrad campaign. Was Hitler's decision to attack the city strategically sound, or did it represent diversion from more important objective of capturing Caucasus oil fields? Some argue Stalingrad was reasonable objective because controlling the Volga would have interdicted Soviet supply lines and protected German forces' flank. Others contend the city could have been masked and bypassed rather than assaulted directly, or should have been abandoned once initial assault bogged down. Similarly, historians debate whether Paulus should have disobeyed Hitler's orders and attempted breakout in late December when Manstein's relief force came within 35 miles. Was his obedience to orders proper military discipline or catastrophic failure of command responsibility? Manstein believed Paulus should have broken out, criticized him after the war for excessive deference to Hitler's authority when situation demanded initiative. Defenders of Paulus note that German military culture emphasized obedience to orders as fundamental principle, that Paulus had been promised relief was coming and air supply would sustain his army. The Soviet conduct of operations around Stalingrad is generally praised by military historians as demonstrating sophisticated planning and execution matching, or exceeding German capabilities in mobile warfare. Some Western historians during Cold War dismissed Soviet victories as merely numerical superiority and willingness to accept casualties rather than genuine military skill. More recent scholarship recognizes that Soviet commanders' planning Operation Uranus demonstrated thorough understanding of operational art. Deception fooled German intelligence about Soviet intentions. Concentration of force achieved overwhelming local superiority despite overall German advantages. Exploitation of enemy weaknesses represented by inferior Romanian armies. Coordination of multiple fronts required sophisticated timing and communication. All of this required abilities that couldn't be dismissed as merely throwing masses at German defenses. Demonstrated Soviet military leadership had developed competence carrying Soviet forces to Berlin by 1945. Treatment of German prisoners after Stalingrad remains controversial because Soviet camps had horrific death rates, killing vast majority within months or years. Soviet defenders argue German prisoners were treated no worse than Soviet prisoners in German camps, where millions died from deliberate starvation, disease, exposure, murder. Critics respond that atrocities by one side don't justify atrocities by the other, that basic human decency required providing minimal care, regardless of what Germans had done. The truth probably lies somewhere between these positions, with Soviet treatment influenced both by genuine resource limitations and by desire for revenge against an enemy causing unprecedented suffering. The psychological impact of Stalingrad on both German and Soviet societies was profound and lasting. For Soviet Union and later Russia, Stalingrad became the defining symbol of resistance against foreign invasion threatening to destroy the Soviet state. The sacrifice required to defend the homeland. Ultimate victory despite casualties and destruction on scales that would have broken less determined peoples. Soviet propaganda elevated Stalingrad into mythology where every defender was hero, where the city's resistance proved Soviet system superiority, where victory demonstrated invincibility of peoples defending socialism. This mythological version ignored or minimized blocking detachments shooting retreating soldiers. Chaotic initial response when defenses nearly collapsed. Harsh treatment of soldiers accused of cowardice. Role of Western Allied material aid. Post-Soviet. Russian accounts have somewhat adjusted these narratives by acknowledging Stalin's mistakes and costs of his methods, including purges, weakening the Red Army and refusal to authorize withdrawals, leading to unnecessary casualties. But Stalingrad remains absolutely central to Russian national identity and narratives about the Great Patriotic War, shaping how Russians understand their country's role in World War II and global affairs. For Germany, Stalingrad became symbol of failure and catastrophe, where Hitler's hubris and strategic incompetence destroyed an army that might have been saved. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility died in ruins, demonstrating Germany was fighting a war it couldn't win against enemies whose resources and determination exceeded Germany's ability to match. German veterans who survived Soviet captivity and returned home in 1950s often refused to discuss their experiences because memories were too traumatic or because German society during Reconstruction preferred to forget the war. The few memoirs that emerged from German Stalingrad veterans emphasized suffering and hardship of fighting in impossible conditions, while often minimizing the broader context of why German forces were in Soviet Union invading a neighboring country. Modern military analysts studying Stalingrad focus on tactical and operational lessons remaining relevant to contemporary warfare, including advantages defenders enjoy in urban combat where attackers' superiority can be negated, the difficulty of sustaining operations at the end of extended supply lines, the dangers of becoming fixed in attritional battles, negating advantages in maneuver warfare, the critical importance of realistic logistics planning rather than optimistic assumptions, the Luftwaffe's failure to supply the Stalingrad pocket despite Göring's promises, has become classic case study in how optimistic logistics planning based on best-case assumptions leads to catastrophic failures. Role of ideology in sustaining both sides. Willingness to continue fighting despite catastrophic casualties is one of Stalingrad's most significant aspects. Neither side could have sustained losses of this magnitude if fighting had been about purely strategic objectives rather than being understood as existential struggle between incompatible systems that couldn't coexist. Soviet soldiers believed they were defending families who would face enslavement or death if Soviet Union lost their system, their survival against an enemy Nazi ideology defined as subhuman. German soldiers increasingly understood they were fighting for own survival because Soviet victory would mean harsh treatment of prisoners and German civilians if Soviet forces reached German territory. This mutual understanding that the war was existential helps explain why both sides accepted casualties at Stalingrad that in previous conflicts would have led to negotiated settlements or recognition that continuing was pointless. The Eastern Front in general and Stalingrad in particular became struggles of annihilation where both sides fought with understanding that compromise wasn't possible. That victory required completely destroying enemies' military capacity and political will to resist. This is Stalingrad, August 1942 through February 1943. 6 months that broke the German Wehrmacht and demonstrated the Soviet Union would not be conquered regardless of cost. 6 months where a city on the Volga became the most important battlefield in the world, where the outcome of World War II was decided through brutal attrition, killing hundreds of thousands and destroying an entire German army that seemed invincible months earlier. 6 months showing how industrial warfare fought by totalitarian states for existential stakes produces casualties and destruction on scales peacetime societies can barely comprehend. Remember Stalingrad for what it was A battle where both sides demonstrated courage and endurance, exceeding normal human limits, while also committing acts of brutality, revealing how war destroys moral constraints that usually govern human behavior. Where strategic incompetence by leaders on both sides caused unnecessary suffering for soldiers who deserved better leadership. Where the outcome demonstrated that wars of aggression started by totalitarian regimes ultimately bring destruction back upon the aggressor. Remember the soldiers who fought there on both sides, who suffered and died in conditions that seem unimaginable to people who have never experienced combat. They deserve to be honored not as symbols or statistics, but as individuals who endured hell because their leaders demanded it and because they had no choice but to fight or die. Remember Stalingrad as the city that broke the Wehrmacht and changed history's course, where the tide turned against Nazi Germany, where the road to Berlin began, 6 months costing, over 1 million lives and destroying. A city but ultimately helping end a war that would have continued longer, claiming even more victims if the battle had been lost. This is Stalingrad, the most brutal battle in human history, where 2 armies fought to mutual exhaustion, and where one side's ability to sustain casualties slightly longer determined victory in a struggle, leaving both victor and vanquished traumatized by experiences, haunting survivors for rest of their lives. Remember them, all of them. Honor their sacrifice, understand their suffering, learn from their tragedy. This is Stalingrad, the turning point, the battle that changed everything, 6 months of hell that broke the Wehrmacht and opened the road to Berlin and final victory over Nazi Germany.